Welcome to Feedback Studio. In this video we're going to be exploring how to create rubrics in Feedback Studio. Now if you don't know what we mean by a rubric, or if you're not sure, then it might be worth you having a look at the video that introduces rubrics before continuing with this one. Now there are 4 types of rubrics that you can set up in Feedback Studio with varying levels of complexity. There's the standard, the custom and the qualitative. Now these are the 3 full rubric versions. And then there's the new grade form, which is a simplified rubric system. We're not going to be looking at these different kinds of rubric in detail in this video. We'll look at each of them in separate videos. In this video, we're just going to be looking at how to set up a rubric. To begin with, I'm going to introduce you to the Rubric Manager in Feedback Studio and show you how to begin setting up rubrics in there. Then I'll show you how you can use a template to create your rubrics more comfortably and upload them into Feedback Studio. We'll begin though with Moodle. Here we can see an assignment that has been set up for testing. Now I know it doesn't look like UEL's Moodle, but just ignore that for now. Now, if you have already used Turnitin before and used rubrics, then this page will be fairly familiar to you. But we're concerned right now with the top half of the page, where you can see all the information about the assignment. The title, start date, due date, post date, and marks available. If you want to know more about any of these things, you can look at the video on setting up the Moodle plugin, and that will tell you. The bit we're interested in right now, though, is this strange little Lego-like icon here on the right. Hovering over it, we can see that this is the button to launch the Rubric Manager, and this is what we want, so let's click it and see. Okay, so this is a hugely unimpressive window, but that's because there's nothing in it yet. Unless you have used rubrics before, then you'll see the last rubric that you've used showing up here. Or if you've inherited an assignment with a rubric already attached, then you might see that here. But we're just assuming here that you haven't used it before and you get this blank window. Let's go through the window and explain it. The window is organized as you might expect a table to be. There are rows, and these are the criteria which will run horizontally. And there are the columns. These are the scales running down. Down at the bottom here are the buttons that enable you to switch between the different kinds of rubric, from the standard to the custom to the qualitative. We'll be looking at these in separate videos. Just 2 other buttons. Up here in the top right is a button with options to import or export a rubric, and we'll come back to this in a moment. On the top left is where the fun starts, because this is where we can begin to create new rubrics. You can see the options to create a new rubric or a new grading form. The grading form, again, we're going to be looking at in a separate video, so let's go ahead and select Create New Rubric. We can see straight away that our criteria are now clearly set out in rows, and our scales for evaluating those criteria are running along in columns. The first thing we want to do is to give our rubric a name. Remember that you can have as many different rubrics as you want, and you'll have access to all of them from whatever course you're working on. So to avoid having a huge number of different rubrics and not really knowing which one is which, it's probably a good idea to give your rubrics a name that will help you to know exactly what they are. In the example we looked at in the video on introducing rubrics, we used an example from a module on language acquisition, so let's go ahead and use that for a title. We can now fill in the rubric itself. Now each of the criterion can be given a title, and this is helpful because the title is the main view of the criteria that we'll have when we're grading an assignment. It will look a little bit like this. The main information about the criteria can be entered into the main box just underneath the title. And this is where, in our original example, our learning outcomes went. Now, if we wanted to delete one of the criteria, we can do so by clicking on the little dustbin icon that appears when you hover over the criterion itself. If you wanted to add more criteria, you can do so by clicking on the plus icon next to the word criteria. Let's go ahead and add the learning outcomes which we used from the previous example. The scales along the top represent the grade bands for the assignment. Now you can of course make these anything you want, but again in our example we used the honours degree classifications. Again, you can delete any scale by clicking on the dustbin that appears when you hover over the scale. You can add more scales by clicking on the plus icon from the word scales. Let's go ahead and add those honours degree classifications now. As you go on, it's worth you saving regularly, and you can do this by clicking on the Save button just down at the bottom right here. Now, let's go on and fill in the rest of this rubric using the example we used in the video on introducing rubrics. And there we are, not too difficult. And having gone through all of this manually, I'm now going to delete the whole lot and show you another, perhaps easier way to do exactly the same thing. There. Now, as you may have noticed from watching me fill in the rubric, this small pop-up window can sometimes feel, well, frustratingly small. You have to keep dragging back and forth with the sliders in order to reach the panels just off screen, and you might find yourself wishing that you could complete the rubric in a bigger window and then bring it into the rubric manager. Unfortunately, there's no way to copy and paste multiple cells into the rubric manager, and neither is there a way to import a table from a Word document. However, it is possible to download a specific template from the Rubric Manager, using this to complete the rubric before importing it in all one go. Let me show you. For this, we need to go to the little button on the top right where we can find the options for importing and exporting rubrics. I'm going to click here on Import. Right now, I'm not actually interested in importing anything because I don't have anything to import. What I need though is this button here, which will give me a spreadsheet template that I can use to complete my rubric. Clicking on it will open up a dialog box asking me where I want to save the template, and when I have saved it, I can open it up and enable the editing. This document looks very straightforward. We have our scale titles along the top and our criteria down the left, and we simply have to fill in the cells. One thing to note though is that the criteria title and description both appear in the same cell on the left here. If we want Feedback Studio to be able to tell the difference between the title and the description, we need to make sure that we leave the blank line here. If this blank space is deleted, Feedback Studio won't see the difference and think it's all the title. Otherwise, we can complete the rubric just as we did in the Rubric Manager, but possibly a little more easily. And here, true Blue Peter style is one I made earlier. You'll see that I've added the scales, a title for each criteria, and a description, which is the learning outcomes from the language acquisition module. I can now go back to the Rubric Manager and either click the button to browse to the location of my rubric, or I can simply drag the file across from my file explorer. And there it is, the same result as filling it in with the rubric manager. So there we go. 2 different ways of creating a new rubric in Feedback Studio. Have a play and see which one you find the easiest.